Hi, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us on this very busy President's Day weekend. I'm honored to be joined in conversation by none other than Lyle Ashton Harris, an artist whom I respect deeply, whose vast influence on the field of contemporary art continues to reveal itself in unexpected ways. And many in this room know and love Lyle, but before I begin, I'd just like to formally introduce him. Lyle Ashton Harris has cultivated a diverse artistic practice ranging from photography and collage to video installation and performance art, examining the impact of race, gender, and desire on the contemporary social and cultural dynamic globally through intersections of the personal and the political. Harris has been widely exhibited internationally, and his work is included in the Solomon R. Guggenheim Museum, MoMA, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Whitney, and the Tate Modern, among many other public and private collections. His Ektachrome Archive was the subject of a photography monograph published by Aperture in 2017, and an exhibition catalog published by ICA Miami in 2023. A solo exhibition spanning 3 decades of his work was presented with an accompanying catalog by the Queens Museum, New York in 2024. And before we begin, I do want to thank many people who helped make this happen. Tommy Gear in absentia in Los Angeles, Lyle's studio, the team at Baldwin Gallery. Thank you, Richard, Kiki, Kirsten, for lending that amazing work that we'll talk about in the back. We have the rare opportunity not only to see this beautiful PowerPoint presentation, but you get to see the work itself. And on that note, just last week, Lyle closed his exhibition Shadow Works at Baldwin Gallery, which was a total triumph. So we're really, really proud to have you back. 2 Lyle Ashton Harris's in one winter season. We're very lucky. And at the museum, right now we have 2 exhibitions by Glenn Ligon and Jacqueline Humphreys, and they demonstrate the ways in which artists build upon what already exists, what they have already made, reservoirs of imagery that are recast through the retrospective view of the artist. And in many ways, Lyle's work does this too. So this is something that I want the audience to kind of keep in mind as we move through this slideshow, this idea of returning to what you once made. And speaking of returning, this incredible work from 2002 that you showed here in Aspen, I believe, on your first trip out here. I wonder, we can maybe ground the conversation in this remarkable image and maybe some impressions of your first experience in Aspen back in 2002.
Thank you, Daniel. First of all, I just want to say it's been a real treat, as we said over lunch today. I feel like we've had the talk a number of times, so. But it's good to be here. And yeah, I wanted to start with this Billy 21 because it was my first time, the late, great Harley Baldwin and Richard invited me out to do a show. And in fact, I met Harley through our dear friend Tim Halen, and I just returned from living in Rome. I went to Peter Rome, and I came back 5 days before 9/11. I thought I was gonna come back and take New York by storm, but the world had other things. So anyway, Richard had said to me, Harley had said to me, well, why don't you think about doing some new self-portraits? And I've been resistant to doing that, so I said, well, he and Richard invested some cash. I did what I thought was going to just maybe 10 self-portraits, and I hit a landmine in terms of really this very generative body of work. I should just say that a year before, I was after the American Academy in Rome, and I had been listening to not one album, but one track by Billie Holiday on repeat for 12 hours at the American Academy, and the director at that time told me, I think you need to turn it off, because I was very much into method, so, and then, so with the prompt to make 10 new self-portraits, this work came out of that. And I should just say, at the time for the opening at Baldwin Gallery, that people were saying, where did you get these rare photographs of Billie Holiday? So at the time, people assumed that this was actually real portraits of Holiday herself, so.
And it points to this undercurrent in the work that I think we'll see throughout this presentation, which I have to say is really remarkable that you made this for us because it brings together materials that I think have otherwise not been seen before. You really did a deep dive into your own work, and this could have gone so many different ways, but one thing that connects a lot of this work is this idea of layering, of bringing two things together. And even though this is a single image, I think all of the associations, not only of yourself as a successful artist at this time, but also the whole history of Billie Holiday merge. And nothing ever really exists in a vacuum in your work. Everything is always kind of in dialogue with the other. And I think that that's an important thing to think through as we look through this kind of multiplicity of images.
And I think it's also important to somehow say that what we did with this particular PowerPoint, as opposed to showing the 101 greater hits, to do sort of a discursive way of thinking about my practice over the years, and then as a way to think how we arrive at the shadow work. So to your point, we thought we would share this one with you. This is from my graduate thesis at CalArts, and this is probably the least structured of the wall, and these were just a series of images, portraits, or self-portraits in some cases, or friends, very diaristic, friends, lovers, romantic obsessions, et cetera. So, and this was from the wall at CalArts in 1990. And for the Queen's show, we actually restaged this. So I had all these on file, so.
There's a beautiful quote by your friend and collaborator, ICA Miami, that I'll just bring into the room, where he says, you bring a casual rigor to the documentary impulse. And I think that that's something that you really see at play here in an installation that, for the uninitiated, might look like something in progress, or might be something coming together. There's a lack of fixity. It feels like this could all change. And I'm wondering, earlier work, we were talking earlier today, as you were finishing your undergraduate studies at Wesleyan, you went to CalArts and you had this pretty radical shift from these more kind of focused, formally composed works to what really feel like the bringing together of an archive, this archival impulse as well as a documentary impulse. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that rupture, because it feels like that's what, in many ways, kind of sent you on a path to where you are now.
Well, that's a
big question.
Complex question. I guess I could say that I wish I had more images to show from this particular installation, but out of this came works that became, well known. But what I love about this particular wall is that, in a way, it was, having done 2 years at CalArts in that rigorous program, this for me felt it was very personal, to insist on the personal, to insist on the intimacy at that time through these snapshots, obviously influenced by Nan or et cetera, just the idea of things which are not so fixed, if you will, particularly after making the work at Wesleyan, that when I showed that work at CalArts, as I was sharing earlier over lunch, like the Americas series, that my undergraduate honor thesis now is in major institutions internationally. When that work at the CalArts, they were very much of a post-studio program, which means it was not about the darkroom. It was about theory and ideas, and particularly it was very much involved in second wave AIDS activism. We were expected to be, without question, be thinking more discursively around language and text and not making work in the studio itself. So it was important for me to reclaim a certain level of intimacy with the familiar, if that makes any sense.
But that feeling of rupture also really comes through here, a year later, as you enroll in Whitney ISP, you're back in New York. It's such an amazing image, and one that is good to keep in mind as we look at works from 96, 2006. Yeah. But around this table, or around this stool, are all of these snapshots, many of which would find their way into other works later on. But to that end, I feel like there is this really intense embrace of this deluge of images that you've amassed. Dealing with them in a very sculptural way, too. I'm wondering if you could talk about this, as Glenn and Jacqueline also were Whitney ISP students. So this is a really important moment that I'm glad the museum is kind of digging into. Everyone has their own ISP
I think
story.
it's great to share this, because this has never been shown in a talk. It was illustrated in my 2024 ICA Ektachrome catalog. And I think what's important to document, because what this Polaroid, or furnishes the evidence, if you will, if you look in the upper right corner, it says, "His come my blood and my here." This, for me, this Polaroid actually gives a documentation that what would become known as a watering hole from 1996 had its early mark making. So it talks about the iterative process of making, if that makes any sense. So I listened to Jacqueline and Glenn's brilliant conversation, just thinking about CalArts at that particular time. And I had a different trajectory. I mean, similar in terms of the pressure of theory, but it was also coming out of CalArts in terms of like the, coming out of CalArts and moving to New York, and also the idea of second wave AIDS activism. What is it also being triggered by the whole Jeffrey Dahmer story, the consumption around the body, et cetera? What did it mean to somehow, this was the final project. So, I mean, just to give you a little background, I was wearing, in this very formal program at, the Whitney ISP, very theory, I had on thigh-high boots and a pair of like cut off. I mean, the show, in a way, at the end of this whole year of intense theory, well, not so much F you, but the fact that I'm actually gonna somehow really begin to start engaging with language and text. So in a way, it was a way to unpack that image, to move away from the privileging of a certain type of image and sort of to think about the everyday. So there was a performative aspect, without question, to it.
And so here, this image to me feels like an explosion. And then we go to this, which is from your body of work from 1994, from the Good Life exhibition at Jack Tilton. That was, a really monumental moment for you and brought a lot of new eyes to the work. Some may say this is even a more quiet image in some way, though no less powerful. But I'm so interested in these kind of early ruptures that happen with artists, and then these kind of transitions to something else. And, did creating The Good Life feel like something else, or did it feel more like a continuation of what you had been kind of itching in ISP?
Well, the Good Life is my first solo show in New York. Yeah. So at that time, Jack Tilton wanted me to do a two-person show with the great Luigi Antoni, and that would have been a very different trajectory, if you can imagine. So I was advised against them. But anyway, what it meant to me to do that Whitney program, but to somehow go back, because New York is a very different program than, let's say, a different environment than, let's say, CalArts, or excuse me, LA, where the California is the Wild West. Yep. Certain forms of production could be made out there, because there wasn't the pressure of the institution, there wasn't the pressure of Yale, et cetera. So it was important for me at that time to, people know Michael Stewart, obviously. Michael Stewart was a great graffiti artist and artist. He was best friends with Jean-Michel Basquiat. As you know, Michael Stewart was killed by New York's finest. In fact, there was a very important show, Defacement, a couple of years ago at the Guggenheim. This work was in there. But Michael Stewart, his death, his murder, it triggered a certain radicalization of the East Village, where people gathered around in terms of issues, in terms of opposing police violence, et cetera, because he was a very gentle person. In fact, Jean-Michel Basquiat went to West Africa because he was traumatized by the murder of Michael Stewart. So I was interested, what does it mean to somehow that use art as a way to resuscitate, if you will, let's say his embodiment, if you will. So for example, when the New York Times, when Holland Carter wrote about this photograph, they did a biography, and this photograph has been illustrated more than a couple of times in the New York Times, and it's an opportunity through the process of art to bring people back into, move beyond amnesia, if you will, and to talk about the history. So it is curious because Jack Tilton at the time on 49 Green Street, so the FedEx coming in. So this is, most people assume this was a woman police. They had no idea it was me in drag, et cetera. In fact, what does it mean for me to somehow to take on this costume, if you will, and to have a direct confrontation, let's say, with the viewer in terms of the idea of death, violence around the body, etc. So I'm interested in this. So, to get back to your question, I think this would not have happened. This type of work would not have happened with the type of rupture that happened at the Whitney ISP program. But it was important to constitute the self in a way to make that type of intervention, if that makes any sense.
But it's interesting too because there's a beautiful tension between title, subject, and background in this. Like there's something really elemental about this image, but you're throwing it into a really complex relationship. Like nothing feels entirely straightforward in this image either.
Yeah. And most people probably know the red, black, and green. Contrary to popular belief that people dated to the 1970s, it was accepted as the official colors for the black race by Marcus Garvey at the Universal Improvement Association 1919 conference. So I was very much interested in how that the possibility of liberation in the flag was co-opted by a certain heteronormative notion of who could lay claim to its liberatory potential. So what does it mean to take this flag, if you will, and to give it elasticity to tease, if that makes any sense? Yeah.
And I should note that...
Is this making sense to people?
Yeah?
Right.
Okay, so I should also note... we could go deep. But across the show, these images span multiple images in the good life. So it exists in the background here, but if you imagine yourself in the exhibition, you're constantly being confronted with this.
The whole gallery is painted with black and green.
Exactly.
So, that was important. So, people can read about it, but the show was considered a landmark show in terms of thinking about not only race, but sexuality. One could talk about sexuality or race independently, but how the work forced people to engage with the multiplicity of those identities. So Richard Powell, the great art historian, ushering in a new possibility. So that's how, so it was important. That could have been done with the Whitney stuff, but it was important that to deploy a certain formality to bring people in, than to have a certain type of discussion, if that makes any sense.
Well, that's a very good move into here. Speaking of formality, back in LA, off of this incredible landmark show that very much felt like an arrival of an exceptional talent, you go to LA, this is your studio wall. It's an outtake from a print publication, which I also think is really important to keep in mind considering the way magazine images find their way into this installation. But I'm wondering if you could tell a little bit about this because it's ultimately what leads you to the watering hole in '96, or the watering hole is maybe even being made.
This is the watering hole formation. This is 1996.
Exactly.
The watering hole premieres September. I did Good Life 2 years before, September. This is in Silver Lake. I am trying to work through this story around Jeffrey Dahmer consumption of the body. So initially, I had bought 10 panels, and I thought initially I was going to show the montages on the panels themselves, but it's very interesting people coming to the studio, people were more drawn to less challenging material, so it was important for me as an artist to engage, to deploy the idea of the cut. If you think about the great Dadaist Hannah Hawk, who up until 20 years ago was a footnote, let's say, in art history,
right.
But with Lynn Zalabansky's show, put her in her right position as being the architect of. So the idea for ethnographic series. So I realized I actually have to go in and to not only show the installation, but to photograph them. And the idea of the cut comes in. So the level of specificity of how the framing was important, if that makes any sense.
And, thinking this kind of leads into the next question is the journey of this work. You had the journey of making the work.
How much time do we have?
I mean, we could go deep, but we're almost starting kind of at an ending or a culmination here.
I should just say that so for the audience knows.
Yes.
The first show was successful. Been written about, etc. But my dear Jack Tilton, the late great Jack Tilton. Marty Eisenberg, Bed Bath & Beyond, or A.C. Hutchins, the biggest, Hammonds, they all got work. The second show was a whole different ball game. I lost a lot of Jack's next door neighbors collectors. It was when Paul Schimmel, the director, I believe, at LA MoCA, when he came in, I mean, Jack freaked out. So this work on the eve of the show opening, Jack did not want to get wallpaper up. So we had to, in the 11th hour, Daphne, who does all of Rob Golber's installation, you know, Super Dyke, came in and said, this is what it's going to take. You know what I'm saying? And that show got up. And so, but it was tough. As I mentioned to you, I escaped to Canada, you know, to Banff for 2 months because the level of reaction, you know, to what people could not figure out. So, but the great late Barbara Gladstone got one for She Gotta Work, and Robert Rosenblum, you know, to this day, you know, curator at large, highly influential at the Guggenheim. To this day, he died 10, 12 years ago. His wife, Jane, his widow, the toughest of the work hangs in her living room. So there was, even though that the work, I lost a lot of collectors, I mean, I was also getting sober and stuff like that, there was an understanding from artists that this was an artist show. This is not a collector show. This was a show that it was about ideas. And it's an interesting pedagogical moment because, as you know, artists do difficult work, they shut down, they get a negative reaction, and then that's it.
Right.
And what it meant to caretake the work, to have other artists do that, theorists such as yourself, shepherd the work. And then eventually, through meeting, you know, Aggie Gunn, my dear friend and patron Aggie Gunn, through her daughter Kat, she acquired it for MoMA. But that was 20 years later. So again, for those who were young or in school, that was like, okay, because at any given moment, one could cave in.
Exactly.
So I want to just sort of say.
But it can't be understated. I think sometimes we're so used to this idea of a work of art arriving into the world and being met with open arms, and everyone knows what to do with it right away. And there's this, I think this work is such a remarkable case study in something that is, you know, hard to parse. It's hard to understand because images like this, I mean, the incredible, you know, reference to Hannah Hoke, but this is not a single image. This is not a single history. You're containing and reaching outward to things that are also really unruly, really difficult to articulate, not only verbally, but in an image. It can't just be held in one image. And you know, I was saying this installation at MoMA was really remarkable because you turn a corner and you first encounter that panel on the left, and you know, there's this beautiful ambulatory experience as you're walking down each panel. Lyle's put some beautiful details here.
The danger of going back to the body and asking it to speak. That's by bell hooks, but of course the post-its, obviously Liz Taylor, Donna Summers. The lower left is young. It's when Magic Johnson came out as being HIV positive, and this is the response to, let's say, some young college or high school, you know, basketball players. Yeah, and then also the race card. Yeah, so it's a way, it was like, I mean, what's interesting for me, it's about process, you know. Better Days, for example, that's when I sort of came out. I mean, this little postcard, you know, in Harlem right there to, let's say, vintage porn. Well, Luigi and Tani.
Oh, there he is. But it's
my mother.
It's all there. I mean, to have this spill forth and to think back, you know, think back to that image from 1991 at ISP where you have all the photos around that stool. The way an idea can, you know, start to take shape and also exist in the recesses of your mind for over 5 years. You know, I mean, and then you arrive at this. So to me, as a curator, it's a real reminder of the time that artists need to deliver the thing that they need to bring into the world.
And also culture.
For sure.
I mean, you know, that's the thing about art, the fact that often it takes time, you know, for the culture to catch up. I mean, the fact that with Ryan Murphy, when he was doing his a series on Jeffrey Dahmer, that this was part of the mood board, the fact, so stuff has a way of catching up, and that's the power of, the contemporary or art, historically,
And I think this idea of catching up and looking back is also quite important. I'm going to go to the next slide. We're going to hear some music. We'll see this first. This is it quite recently at Art Basel Miami and Meridians. Beautiful, beautiful installation there. And then we go here to Grace Jones. You had a front row seat. I'll give a little bit of backstory and then we'll jump in. But after a 7-year period of living in Ghana from 2005 to 2012, Lyle returned to New York City and encountered a monumental treasure trove of 33,000 images that you and sometimes your peers made from the late 80s to early 2000s. And collectively, these became one of your most celebrated works, your Ektachrome Archives, which have been exhibited around the world at the Sao Paulo Biennial, the Whitney Biennial, the Centre Pompidou in Paris. And in an interview on the occasion of the Pompidou presentation, you noted that making this body of work felt like breathing. And at that time, its accrual wasn't necessarily a process of like making art, but a way of seeing the world. And that moment of encounter in returning to New York, finding these materials and saying, I'm making something out of this. I'm curious if you can talk about that encounter and that process, and then we can go into a little bit more about, what we are seeing on the screen.
I could try. Now, I just want to say, in terms of, I'll get to that, and you might have to, re-ask me the question, and just looking at it right now, and just thinking of the passage of time, and Gary and I had the opportunity, to be together and to spend time with Richard and Keek and Kirsten, for the showing. I hadn't seen Gary in a number of years, and the fact that, as I mentioned to you, Gary was big man on campus at CalArts, and he, then I followed in his footsteps, and just thinking about the passage of time and aging, and also of death, and people, it memorializes, many people have gone on, and, friends, and So I don't know how you want to sort of say that. So just thinking about the passage of time, and so I was really grateful to spend the time, with Gary here, and just also just thinking about what does it mean to be, elders, and to be confronted with the youth. I mean, we all obviously
Yeah.
have that experience. So I think there's something about the archive that does that. So, but you characterized it correctly. I came back from 7 years in Ghana, where I was living. I was teaching at NYU, maintained a studio practice there, and had a very public life there, and formal in a lot of ways. And Isaac was, soon after returning, Isaac Julian, a friend, had asked me to use some of my snapshots to illustrate his catalog for 10,000 Waves at the Modern. So I had deposited all of these slides over, maybe 5,000 or more at my mother's house in 2000 when I won the Prix de Rome. Everything else went in storage. But I said, I know that most likely that the storage will burn down versus my mother's house. I just spiritually.
Good
I mean, just in
instincts.
terms of, I needed that spirit.
It's
that
where it needed to
protection,
be.
So
Yeah.
they were like in, bags, et cetera. I mean, they were archived, but, nonetheless,
Yeah.
they came down, and all of a sudden, I'm confronted with this, this treasure trove of images from the past, and, capturing very intimate, personal, but also moments of intimacy with friends, et cetera. And so, in addition for them illustrating Isaac's book, I did a presentation up at Yale. Crutzen and Rob Storer asked me to come and give a slide lecture, and I thought initially I was going to do collages out of them. And it was amazing that the students at Yale, who were not alive when they were made, they were deeply into them in terms of what was happening. There was a freshness in them. So that began the project, and just to sort of so we don't spend too much time on it, I remember time at T-Lax or MoMA came by, and also Eva Raspini. I think she was still at the MoMA at the time, before heading up to the ICA. She says there's the archive, right?
Right.
But then what comes out of the archive, so that it doesn't just remain in terms of nostalgia, but how do you use the archive, or deploy, if you will, to create new meaning, et cetera. So that's...
And to that end, we can see one of its first installations here. One of the things, and this is maybe a silly question, but there are so many luminaries in these images. You have Thelma Golden, Essex Hemphill, Marlon Riggs, Stuart Hall. It's endless how many people. Douglas Crimp. It's out of control, the value of this archive. But what I love about this presentation too is that it really captures the holistic life of an artist in this way, and that you show these people at work too. It's very easy to talk about how beautiful the intimacy is, and there is that. You see these beautiful pictures of Marlon and Belle laughing on a couch. It's one of my favorite images from this. But you also see the black male opening at the Whitney. You see the waiters at the opening. There's a really good picture of you with one of the very handsome ones. But I think it's fascinating to capture that side of things too. And it made me yearn for an art world that I don't know if I'll ever know. And I'm curious about your relationship to that side of the work, that depicting of the way things were at museums, at these things, where all these, dynamics might have taken a back seat when you step into a kind of professionalized space. I'm curious about this idea of artists at work in the Ektachrome archives.
That's an interesting question. I think for me it's also important, to say, to the audience that these images were shot or taken out of necessity for me to find my own space. I wasn't like I happened, it was important for me, even the black male show, that these images that are the black male, Thelma clearly has black and white images of the installation, but I was there taking photographs of the party with my camera. It's in the tradition of my grandfather, who shot over 10,000 slides documenting his friends, family, church, etc. So even thinking, I think it's important but for this generation, because we can have amnesia around now post-gay marriage, people are queer and stuff like that. At that time, when those images known as constructs were shown, the likes of Russell Simmons, et cetera, I was persona non grata, you know. Both Thelma was for that show. Now it's a historic into the landmark show, but the reaction to it at that time and the heat, if you will. So the camera became a way that I could negotiate. I felt safe behind the camera.
Yeah.
I could be there. I could, I could be present, It was a form of breathing in a way. It was a form of and then also exploring intimacy. Like, for example, the photograph of, let's say, Belle and Marlon. We know or your generation will know the official image of her, but to see these two people engaging in a caress, he's advanced stages of HIV, and what does it mean to care? The practice of, the work of caring and intimacy. So when the New Yorker, when she passed away, that's a photograph they use as opposed to an official portrait. So I think there is this yearning for intimacy, or how do we, the care of intimacy as a way to somehow offer different possibilities.
But then also making an archive spatial, too, is so important to be able to walk through it in this way at this scale. We have another image here from the Whitney, and this idea of really existing out of a frame, unbounded. We'll close the loop in a little bit when we get to the shadow works, but this is something that feels intensely immersive. Yeah. And
to transport one, if you will. I think people, this idea of inviting one in, to a world, and
But prior to this, about 10 years before, you make this work, which is one of my personal favorites of yours and completely a masterpiece. But it's informed not only by your time in Rome in 2001. Your years in Ghana, you had spent a year in Ghana at this point, as I understand it. And again, it feels, like we're harnessing that ISP energy in so many ways. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about Blow Up, because it's going to take us in some fun directions.
Okay, well, I should just say, as I mentioned, I was at the American Academy, and I had just photographed Berlusconi for the New York Times, and I thought I was going to just, hang out and drink Prosecco and eat prosciutto, But my partner at the time, Kevin Walls, he said it's time to get to work. It's always good to choose people who encourage you to work. Anyway, so that morning, there was a cover story in the Herald Tribune on the ugly face of anti-Semitism and racism in European soccer, with Italy being the epicenter. I got in contact with Kathy Ryan, at the New York Times Magazine, my editor, and I wanted I proposed doing a story juxtaposing black soccer players, whether that's Cafu, who was an international megastar, Brazilian, or Masinga, who first took South Africa to the World Cup, or Thuram, was the highest cap division from Guadeloupe, the highest cap player in the French division. I was going to juxtapose against these players against soccer hooliganism. But during research, I became more interested in masculinity and power, and upon doing research, I came across this centerfold image of in the daily sports newspaper, La Gazzetta de Sport, and I was struck by the uncanny resemblance to Manet's Olympia. So here you have Zidane, who course French the World Cup. When he headbutted, rightly so. I think someone might have said something about his mama. And then this unidentified brown-skinned model, decalcing, et cetera. So I was struck how this image became a source of critique, if you will, during the day, but a source of pleasure at night, hence the semen on the regional newsprint. So this is Blow Up number 4. Blow Up number 1 showed at Ronald Hoffman. My friend, dear friend Jim Hodges says, take some of the energy out of the studio, because all this energy in the studio, take some of it into the work. So I did a blow up for Ronald Hoffman, and she said, that's the money wall, no one's gonna buy it. And it's true, no one did eventually, but Oakwin Razor, the great late Oakwin Razor was there, also the head of the the Contemporary Museum in Siena came, and I also showed it a few months later at the Armory. So this is a culmination of imagery from obviously from some of my own work, mediated images, etc. And the centerpiece is it's archival newsprint that's been 8 by 10, just to give you the dimensions of the piece.
And keep in mind that skull that we see.
Well, we were talking over lunch that all of this is my Ghana years of 2005 to 12, and discovering that that skull is from the funerary fabric, and so which meant that although it started in Ghana, it was the idea that the blow-ups captured or gave traction or they, for lack of a better term, they caught the energy of the location in which I was living and working at a particular time. So this blow-up number 4 was done for the Sevilla Biennial, Okri's Biennial. So, yeah.
Just another beautiful detail there. Some earlier works by Lyle as well.
So obviously Katrina, so in the topical, there's obviously the Basquiat. What's curious about it for me, down is the fact that they are works of mine that are more well known, but just to see them as part of a larger image bank, really to that whole idea of high-low as opposed to privileging over one over the other.
Exactly.
And what I love about this is because when I installed this in Sevilla, you would have men who were installing it, they could go into that soccer, so they were brought into multiple conversations. So there's something about the multiplicity of, so that was able to reach multiple people and to engage them, because if they were looking at the soccer, they were also seeing, other types of imagery as well.
Well, there are provocations to enter into the work. I mean, you're leaving all of these doors open and saying, okay, you can walk through this store. What's going to happen, as you move through the hallway, But the velocity of the work that I feel inherent to these images from Ghana, I think, are really important. And we talked about this word, like the rush. And this is a really, revelatory period for you in so many ways, moving through many different currents of Ghanaian culture. We'll just cycle through this image, Untitled Jamestown from 2008. And then this installation from your show at the Queen's Museum. I'm just going to quickly play a little bit of this really beautiful video work that was featured in that show. Maybe you can explain a little bit about what people are seeing too, this kind of base.
Where the fixed image is an image of beach people on a Sunday. It would be a Sunday or Saturday or Sunday, people at the beach. And it's Cape Coast, one of the former slave forts that line the whole of West Africa. In fact, when former President Barack and First Lady Michelle, they didn't go to Amina, they went to Cape Coast, their first trip, from their first couple of years. They didn't go to South Africa. Ghana was the first place they went. What I love about this, for me, it captures just the early impressions of me being in Ghana by myself. And obviously I was with university, and I had met a lot of friends there, but having lived in Africa as a child, as you know, in the early mid-70s, and then my father being in South Africa, this was, in a way, my own homecoming. Well, I'm not beginning per se, but it was the idea of, let's say, as an adult and using film and video as a way to somehow just to capture everyday impressions, if you will. And that was important for me, just in terms of the market, clothing, or various festivals, etc. So, weddings.
Just such a mesmerizing work. It's really so beautiful. Here's one of the images.
And I should just say that this Ghana image, this and the first one, that I wasn't making work per se. I mean, I was out getting fish, with my driver, Peter, who's a dear friend. There was something about being among, quote unquote, the people, and going out and just encountering. This the Wrath of Medusa, but just thinking about, these, the boats coming in, and there's an element of labor happening, women are catching the fish, but just this element of play, I mean, the dance, I mean, it's so beautiful. So it was the capture, an early impression of, let's say, being there and what it meant to, to be there.
But there's a grounding to that, and I think there is a practice that's happening that feels akin to the one that drove the Ektachrome Archive into existence. This idea of wanting the camera, almost needing the camera to be able to ground yourself and to process change, or to process, moving into newness. And the Mobile series from the New York Times Magazine.
This is actually for a week before I was leaving. I never checked junk mail, but I did, and Kathy had asked me to illustrate a story for Anthony Appiah's cover story on cosmopolitanism. So the prompt was to have a Ghanaian person wearing traditional outfit, holding a instrument of technology, a cell phone, as if it was an anomaly. And Americans were shocked, because in actuality, cell phone use is quite even more ubiquitous there. For example, this young woman, the market woman, she, through cell phone use, is able to compete with her equivalent in Togo, for example, but I love this, 2 missed calls.
Yeah, God, it's so good. It's such a good image, and then the women in the background, also holding the phone as well. It's such a great image. And then we get to this.
We get to this because
should we come back to this?
No, we can.
Okay.
What's after here?
No, let's go in. Let's jump in.
I was just going to say, because then the romance.
Exactly, we have to talk about the romance.
We can get to that later.
We'll get to that
but
later.
I was talking about the romance in terms of, let's say, Ghana, if you will, the idealized version. Because in Accra, I find anything I can find in New York. It was very much, I landed, within the first month in terms of what is called the children of a revolution, who could be living anywhere. And so it was very interesting, people living in New York, Paris, et cetera, when they come back to Ghana, all of a sudden they somehow are shrouded in tradition, as opposed to the cosmopolitanism. So I felt like, wait a minute, there's something going on. So this was this installation, it was inspired by 2007. It was anticipation of the 50th year anniversary of independence. Ghana was going through beautification. So this was the fort, Jamestown Fort, and they had moved all the male prisoners from the fort. So I was able to get in at that moment and photograph collages that had been done by the prisoners. So if you go back a couple slides very quickly, so if you imagine outside that fort, if you were in prison, you would have, they were hearing all this, the market. This is a fishing village. So men who were in prison were hearing, it was very melancholic for me to think about what it means to be incarcerated, and then they creating these collages, a way to think about desire and modernity. You can go forward. So there was something in those collages. I should just say this is an installation from the prison that I have actually mapped my own collages onto.
And it's so interesting when this living as a photograph unto itself, as a documentation of the work, to parse it, if you're uninitiated, it's a real challenge. It's difficult to know which images belong to you or which images belong, to others who we may never know. But I'm curious, just if you can kind of situate us a little bit in what we're seeing in this really exceptional detail shot, too.
Okay, for example, this is newsprint that's affixed to the wall. This is, at that time, the sitting president, Kufuor, with the Ghanaian flag. So, clearly they were not giving Elmer's glue and scissors. So we're talking about fixity. Is it semen? Is it saliva? What are they using to somehow cut out? So clearly, so this is a mirror that I've actually juxtaposed on top of that. Obviously, this is the daily guide about critique of this gay conference is supposed to happen, or the tape over the young man. But all the faded images are images that were actually affixed directly to the prison wall by the prisoners.
And then we end here this kind of section, this interlude with a verse. The story is pretty amazing. If you quickly just run through it to kind of close the loop of how this work came into the world.
Okay, so while I was on vacation, while I was in Ghana, I went to vacation and in the north, and it wasn't in the north. It was actually in the east coast. It was by the sea, and coming out, I came across about a dozen fishermen using flour sacks to shield themselves from the sun. So they had been sewn together, and I was struck. So I had to have it. So I did, with my driver and Prince, my partner at the time, I was able to, buy the backdrop, if you will. And so then over 9 years, it developed into what is known as the blow-up verso that premiered in Unlimited in Basel in, I think, 22, I believe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just...
And it's, so I was collaborating with Nicholas Huayo, a sign painter who I've worked with before on some earlier works. And so this was done in Nima, in Ghana, as a Muslim community outdoors. And it was based on the Blow Up 4. But the ink bled through, and we showed the opposite side.
And just the scale is pretty exceptional, thinking about the person standing there. But, it takes us to this, which I think
very briefly, as I mentioned when I first arrived in Ghana, my dear friend Sanam, I landed in Ghanaian society, and I did a portrait of several people, including the First Lady, Rebecca, First Lady Akufo-Addo. And, but it's interesting because, go forward, please, that I was sharing with Daniel that the First Lady did not give me access to Ghana. It was Prince, who I had met, who's Ashanti, but from a very working class background, although he's from royalty, and he was the first to introduce me to the funerary culture, also allowed me to feel safe in Ghana. So what was supposed to be 1 semester became a 3-year contract that led to tenure. In fact, my tenure is based on the research and also the connections I had made in Ghana. But this is, yes, a triptych of Prince.
Yes, and a pretty exceptional video that will lead us into the shadow works.
Yes. How are we doing for time?
Are we doing okay? Yeah? Good? Okay.
What we're looking at is a funeral in Kumasi. It's a Prince's father. It was interesting, very different background than mine, but we had a similar complicated relationship with our fathers. And so I was very much into documenting while I was there, using video as a medium in which to somehow engage with it every day. So I was fortunate enough to somehow be brought into his family and his community.
And it takes us in some way into the work, that you're continuing to this day. thinking about that time and the fabrics. And this is, I believe, the first shadow work that you've made. Thank you. In 2017, about 5 years after you returned from Ghana, using fabric that you sourced during your time there. And I'm wondering if you can kind of talk a little bit about the impetus about framing, which was imparted to you by Okwe Enwezor, or not entirely, but maybe you can tell a little bit about that story.
He did say, Okwe, who was a dear friend and supporter, he had said to me that he loved the combustion of the blow-up works, but he was also quite formal. He felt it needed some sort of framing around it. So, and that was 15 years later. I worked on the shadow works, and I should just say, of all the shadow works, all the images were made for that particular shadow work, with the exception of the first one. Although it was dated 2017, the actual imagery was created in my studio soon after returning, soon after 9/11 in Chelsea. So you can see the reference to Abu Ghraib, the New Yorker expose, and other imagery. So after returning from Ghana and having the Ektachrome Archive take on his whole life, during which time Aggie had acquired the watering hole for the MoMA, I was thinking about how to revisit, if you will, montage, and to be thinking about to also reflect on my time in Ghana, but also the experiential of, because it was almost like a compression of time and space, to have been there for 7 years and to leave and to return to New York and to take on that whole chapter. There was a residue, if you will, of like the ending of the relationship, that period, and I had also acquired several, pieces of fabric. So, so I made the first one for David Castillo for the Miami Basel, and I think in a way, because once the watering hole, there was something about protecting that work, and once that sort of had found a home, if you will,
right.
I was thinking about, well, this way of working, of mark making, is something that I want to return to, and I also want to also have it delve into the experience, of living in Ghana, but also some of the collective images I've been collecting over the years.
And I mean, these works, are so very much about this doubling that almost like, I don't know, there's so many acts of framing that happen within this one work. You have the overarching frame, you have the two images that then kind of merge into one, into this unique form. But the fabric here is also really potent visually, graphically, and it's...
It has a pop aspect.
Exactly.
Yes, yeah.
And it's sitting next to those images in a different way. And I encourage you guys, when we conclude the talk, to really look at that to see how the fabric lives. It's
particularly in
alive.
relationship to the luminosity of the dye subs,
Exactly.
which is aluminum images baked directly into aluminum. Yeah, so it is that tension there. And
within the shadow works, there's a beautiful process of annotation that you undertake that accompany the work in... I'm curious how official it feels for you in terms of this goes with the work, I want to annotate it, I want to kind of include it, because when I went to the show at Baldwin, I was very kindly presented, with a really beautiful, useful document that walks you through all of the elements in every work, and it's an effort in cataloging that I think is quite rare and quite generous for an artist to impart towards a viewer. You see this here in the beautiful catalog for Our First and Last Love, annotated. So I'm wondering if you can talk about that drive to share the annotations.
I think I should say that it came out of during the pandemic. I took a writing class with Laura Davies and every Thursday for about a year. So looking through BLM, through people dying, it was just through the world shifting and having that grounding practice of writing. And so she would say, now here's the real deal during the exercise. I mean, maybe halfway during the prompt, she would say, no, tell me no, here's the real deal. So I don't know, I just sort of felt that it was, I don't know, I think it's about the view, but I think it's really about me, the idea of wanting to like leave that trace, you know?
Yeah.
And I think, so it's a way to give, I guess, a viewer and myself a deeper insight, you know, into some of the material, and I think it's important. I think people, it's rich, you know what I'm saying, because there is such a compression that actually happens. And I'm always applying pressure to the content and the formally driven, but if you even go back to the one that's in the modern, you know, it's interesting just to see there's so much richness in there. So again, one's able to, you know, have multiple, you know, entry points, you know.
And also, you know, to the point about that you were talking about with Eva, you know, how do you make that archive live? You know, a lot of it comes from your own acts of writing.
And then also allowing for, you know, for a younger generation, I think, you know, you'd be surprised how curious people are to know that information, you know, and they're curious and engaged, so, you know.
Another beautiful work. I'm curious, I mean, maybe, you know, at this point, we can...
Should we walk over to the work
walk over to the work and go back together and maybe just all chat. But I just want the room to know, stay tuned for more with Lyle, because this is not the end. It's definitely a beginning. So we're looking forward to working together on more to come very soon. Thank you so much,
thank you so
Lyle,
much
for everything. Thank you.
Thank you.